Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Stitching Consciousness. Today we have with us Mr. Jourdain Vaillant, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, I hope. Mr. Jourdain is basically a French diplomat working for the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. He is also a lecturer at Sciences Po Paris and the French Institute of Public Policies. Mr. Joktan, I'm very grateful to you for taking out the time to do this. I was doing a lot of research about you ahead of this podcast, and I'm really inspired to see that you're so young and have accomplished so much in your life already, which was very inspiring and very interesting to see how the different ministries and the different governments work all over the world. Because in Pakistan, it's very unheard of to have someone so young to be part of the ministry and be part of all of government negotiations and stuff. So thank you so much and welcome on the show.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful. I'm all the more grateful that I was in Pakistan for the first time in my life. In the end of last January, I was in Islamabad and Lahore, and I have to say, I met very high level people regarding the issue of climate change, and also met a few others in some national and local institutions, especially in the context of the training of Pakistani civil servants. And I have to say that there I also met a broad range of very specific and interesting experts I were delighted to meet. So it's a kind of follow up for me since this first time in Pakistan to have the opportunity to have this conversation for you today. So thank you.
Yeah. I so could you briefly explain what you do and maybe a little bit elaborate more about your what about your background basically?
So nowadays I'm a climate negotiator at the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs. I'm exactly at the climate division of the General Directorate on Global Affairs. There I'm a negotiator within the G7, the G20 and the UN context about climate and energy mainly. And as a French diplomat, I entered the career 3 years ago. And a few years before, and actually during quite a long time, I had the opportunity to work on climate and environmental issues before. Then I'm also a teacher. Recently, I started to have lectures on climate diplomacy in Sciences Po in Paris. I also had the opportunity sometimes to intervene as a lecturer in the French National Institute for Public Policies, INSP, formerly called ENA. And I was born and raised in the south of France, and my family background is in between the south and also from the north of the country. I'm in Paris for 10 years, and I really look forward to a conversation about climate change issues. But I have to say, as a disclaimer, that all my views I may express today are expressed on a personal basis. They are not official ones. Of course, this may match our national views, but I had to make this clear that I'm not talking as a French representative today, but much more as a French citizen, and also in my capacity of an expert of climate change, if I may say so. And once again, thank you for having me in this context.
Right. Yeah. So climate change is a reality which cannot be ignored, and it ideally should not be ignored. The carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has been increasing since 1950, and it continues to increase. The population has increased by 3% since 1950. We are eating meat more than ever, which causes even more methane in the atmosphere. We burn fossil fuels like coal, like oil, to run our factories, to run our cars, for electricity. And Pakistan is one of the, I would say, the top 20 countries that is going to be affected, and it's not already being affected by climate change. 50% of our industry, our population is associated with agriculture, and the rest is textile industry. And textile industry causes and creates the largest employment for our labor force in the country. And both these industries use a lot of water. With the lack of resources, both these industries are going to be massively affected. Last year, even we saw that only 40% of the mangoes that we normally produced were produced last year. So we had a loss of 60% mangoes already, which kind of reflects on what is to come. Insecurity, then that leads to national issues like what Sri Lanka is facing. So this climate change is real for us, especially with, even if you talk about weather, we experience heat waves every year. Pakistan experienced the floods last year, which was catastrophic. Millions of people were displaced. There were so many livelihoods that were lost. Um, so in the poor countries are facing the impact of climate change big time, and I'm sure I this was one of the main discussion points in COP27 as well. um, the rich countries, if I'm being candid, are not very in favor of being held liable for the violent weather conditions, and they are, but at the same time, the poor countries should not really be paying for other people's pollution as well. um, there was this loss and damage fund that was agreed upon in COP27. Could you explain a little bit about that? And also, in could you also maybe touch upon the 2009 UN Copenhagen summit that was introduced, which introduced basically the $100 billion that would have to be given by the rich countries to the poor countries, but then only 83 billion was paid, and that was basically a loan which had to be paid back in interest. So could you explain the difference between that and maybe this fund which is being created, and if poor countries would actually have to pay back interest, or is this a loan, or is it a grant, or how exactly does it work? Sorry, long question.
Thank you so much. And if I may first build on what you said regarding the reality we entered, that is something that is not that known, and I would say everywhere in the international community, if we can may say so. You talked about the reality of climate change that did start approximately in the middle of the 19th century. And I here would like to quote a French philosopher that passed away a few months ago, Bruno Latour, that explained that in this regard, considering the rising level of concentration of GAG in the atmosphere, we kind of entered in a new reality that can be called the new climate regime. Actually, I'm used to say to my students that we enter a phase we might never escape. We might never experience in our lifetimes, newspaper titles saying climate change is over. Regarding the inertia of those gases in the atmosphere, we entered in what could be called now the era of consequences. So we're dealing with this reality. We have a few means. We have levies. We have opportunities to meet politically, philosophically, of course, on the ground. It means that our main task today, our generational task, if I may say so, is first to address the issue by limiting the emissions and heading towards the net zero, the neutrality of emissions by the middle of the century, considering, the Paris Agreement, climate agreement that was adopted back in 2015, which aim is to limit the global warming to 2 degrees and if possible 1.5. Our first task is just to limit and to reduce dramatically emissions from now on, and basically are on the coming decades long. Second objective, building adaptation and resilience. Adapting to climate change is also one tremendous and quite demanding generational task of this era of consequences. And as you said, some countries, some regions are more vulnerable than others. The science is clear about this point. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change raised it in this last report on adaptation and resilience that was released back, if I'm not mistaken, 1 year ago, actually, in February 2022. And in this regard, the COP27 was the annual meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in this era of consequences, we have to both have this temptation to, for the ones that are in position to do so, reduce our emissions, and this is made very obvious in the Paris Agreement. Developed countries should take the lead in that regard, considering their historical emissions and their means of implementation of their climate targets. And as another track of negotiation, we now opened more clearly um, discussions, and I'd say also the adoption of targets regarding adaptation, and inside this adaptation track, the issue of loss and damage. Loss and damage inside the Paris Agreement are addressed in a very clear way, according to a threefold typology, to avert, to minimize, and to address loss and damage. Loss and damage could result from climate catastrophes. They have some economic and non-economic impacts. And in this regard, COP27 was the moment where loss and damage were one of the most striking issues on the top of the agenda of the negotiations. And one of the main outcomes of COP27 is clearly the establishment of founding arrangements. The plural is important. Even the S at the end of arrangements was an important item of negotiation. The idea of specifically the loss and damage fund is to create inside the UN framework facility that could aim at addressing loss and damage. But since a lot of vulnerable countries were keen to push this on the agenda, it has been adopted. This is going to be formally established during the next COP. And, the real funds may take a lot of time to be finally delivered. That's why the broader picture is important. This fund is inserted in a broad range of solutions, what we call mosaic of solutions, and those could already benefit from the existing finance tracks that we tackle right after, especially regarding the 1 billion pledge you mentioned before. And that's why we have this new fund, but founding a fund takes a lot of time, and that was part of our points, I would say. That some already existing financial tracks could already, hopefully, and this is kind of good news in that regard, tackle and building resilience, helping countries, and especially vulnerable ones, to adapt to climate change is already one of the top priorities of founding partners, developed countries, international financial institutions, including multilateral development banks, bilateral banks, or I'd say bilateral aid, and the development agency. And for instance, France is giving annually 6 billion euros, and 1/3 of this package is dedicated to adaptation. Coming back to the $1 billion pledge, you're right. This is a commitment that was made a long time ago. I remember the day it was made. I was in high school. I can really remember it. And there were massive expectations regarding that COP15, so back in 2009, regarding the possibility to have an international agreement with real, if I may say so, targets regarding mitigation of climate change, finance, and as a third pillar, adaptation and resilience. This agreement was not really adopted, but the only thing that is still lasting, and that decision that was made back at COP15 in Copenhagen, is this financial target of $100 billion pledge per year from 2020, from developed countries to developing countries. But actually, this is not that known. The sources from this pledge are inside the Copenhagen Agreement considered to be from a wide variety of those, a wide variety of sources, public sources and private sources. Up to now, the international climate community, or let's say fundings, come with a very high majority for public fundings, and especially a few member states to the UN Convention on Climate Change. And the idea, and unfortunately this is where we stand now, this target was not reached in 2020. It is supposed to be reached this year, according to what was called a delivery plan that was released 2 years ago, and that said, from the developed countries, we are able, as a group, to guarantee that this target is going to be met in 2023. So we should be in a position to say that for the first time, developed countries will be able to provide this package for developing countries. But actually, this is also in a broad context in where $100 billion is far from meeting the needs. This is only the part of international finance, and one was agreed back in 2009. But actually, the needs are estimated to be from a basis of $1 trillion a year internationally. I mean, not only in developing countries. This needs to be addressed at the international level from public sources, but also from private sources, from the widest base of contributors, including the ones that are in a position to do so now. And what I could say is that there is also an idea, sense of what is the fair share regarding historical emissions and regarding what is effectively delivered regarding climate finance. And we are considered as a French delegation to be one of the contributors that do kind of meet their fair share regarding their historical emissions with this 6 billion euros a year throughout those channels. But actually, the landscape is so broad that we would need maybe 3 podcasts to just tackle the issues of international climate funding. And this is in addition with the biodiversity funding. There are a broad range of possible links in between those international funding. And back in December, the international community, for the first one, adopted a framework on biodiversity that including a few financial targets too. So this is where we stand now, and the international agenda is still heavily marked by those financial issues, for sure.
Um, Very nicely phrased, very nicely put. So you mentioned adapting as well, adaptation to climate change. One example of, so I'm gonna talk from a Pakistani context.
Mhm.
One way of adapting to maybe floods would be seawalls. If I come on to the next question, um, as to debt cancellation. For instance, if a country is investing money or wants to invest money to adapting to climate change and protecting us from maybe floods and producing maybe like investing in sea walls, we might not be able to do that because we are too busy trying to pay back IMF or paying back the debts. Do you think, I believe it was also discussed at COP27, if I'm not wrong, then maybe there should be debt cancellation for developing countries because they need to focus on protecting ourselves from the impact of climate change. Do you personally believe that that is a good solution or not?
I have to admit that as a French citizen, I'd say that public debt, is a universal issue. For instance, my own state is in a situation of debt, uh, and according to the EU targets, we are far from agreed objectives regarding that. It's also part of the reality we are all experiencing, and of course, there is no direct link with climate vulnerability. And in the context of the climate negotiation, this is an issue. this is an issue that is first, I'd say, tackled within the G20 context.
May I just add over here that France being in debt and Pakistan being in debt are two very different scenarios.
Of
We are at the
course.
stage of bankruptcy at the moment.
Mhm.
Literally, we don't know what's going to happen to the country at this point. So, for us to, we have different priorities at this point. We might not be able to invest in protecting ourselves from these weather conditions, extreme weather conditions, or maybe food insecurity threats as compared to a developed country having debts and having to pay back their loans. So in that situation, that's a little different scenario. So maybe that's why a debt cancellation for a developing country might be more helpful and might be able to create a bigger impact than for a developed country maybe. And also we have undeniably different priorities at this point, because if you would ask someone from on the street over here about climate change and about future generations, they would be more considered about having food for that night than what their great grandchildren are going to face, or what conditions or what world they are going to be living in. Because they, as long as their stomachs are empty, to be honest and to be very blunt, they don't care. Majority of the country does not care what's going to happen in 2050 or 2100, because we don't even know if you're going to survive to be able to have, children do we have generations, our generations over at that time. So that's just to give a little bit of Pakistani context. um what was your experience at COP27 like? How do the negotiations take place? What's it like? I believe it's very exciting. And I was, when I was doing some research, I remember there was some one of these meetings where an agreement was cancelled at the last minute, because it said that the developed countries should pay back or should have carbon emissions reduced to a certain number instead of the word shall. Or you just mentioned that the word s was so important in arrangements. So that must be very exciting. So what's that like?
Yeah, first, let me thank you for your very fair point regarding the debt issue. And of course, I was not meaning that the reality was the same, and the meaning of debt in between countries is equivalent. And of course, the issue is not the same internationally. I should also maybe add that this is part of a package we're going to put forward in a summit we're going to organize in Paris to just consider new options, new financial options, and new solutions. Being part of this mosaic solution, and debt cancellation is not formally at the agenda now, but this is part of the discussion. So we're going to see what we could put on the table to make those innovative finance tools to be implemented and proposed at the international level to tackle the gaps in fundings and to actually enhance access to climate finance and effective delivery, which is really important for all the financial contributors, of course. Coming back on negotiation as well. Negotiations into the climate sphere are not kind of enshrined in a kind of a tradition. This is an emerging tradition because you know that climate negotiations start really formally in the 90s, and now parties, negotiators are kind of used to a broad repertoire of actions, um, of words, and from my perspective, this is of course sometimes linked to very details, and I told you about these founding arrangements in the plural thing, but actually this could be noticed in a lot of other contexts. You mentioned also the shall and the should controversy back in Paris. This was so in 2015, and this is a public fact now. I mean, it has been disclosed, but by then, as the Paris Agreement was close to be adopted on December the 12th of 2015, some delegations wanted to replace the shall that has a binding character uh, in the text regarding climate mitigation, and to have should instead, to actually prevent the Paris Agreement to be legally binding, that's true, but also implying that every party state should go back in front of its parliament to make it adopted. And this actually has a virtue because it allows all delegation parties to adopt the agreement and to respect the sovereignty principle, saying that each party is free to insert those targets in their national legal context. This is important because this is how the Paris Agreement was adopted so widely and so swiftly. But of course, there are drawbacks, and we are dealing with those. But there are so many possible anecdotes in the UN negotiation context that we also experience in G7 and G20. And what I can surely mention is that every international agreement is based on personal issues. It's always relying on personal involvement, and I can tell everything as of now. But every time you read some climate communique agreement statement, there are people behind the lines, and this is not only about politics. This could be also based on personal relationships. What is known to be now the Article 4 of Paris Agreement mentioning, the net zero target is known to be based actually on the negotiation that took place on the very day of COP21, when the French climate ambassador and also president of the session just burst into tears because she was not able to reach an agreement on this net zero paragraph. And she admitted herself she was so moved by the course of negotiations, by the upcoming, at that time, conceived impossibility to draft the agreement, that she could not refrain herself to just cry because she was so tired and she was unable to pursue the efforts she was in because of physical issues. And because of that, some blocking delegations and representatives didn't understand how close they were to an agreement, and thanks to this unexpected episode, finally managed to draft this paragraph on net zero, Article 4, you can see in the Paris Agreement. It just provides a long-term target of a balance in between emission and absorptions of GHG in the second part of the 21st century. But this paragraph is based on personal conditions of negotiations. And actually net zero now is considered to be our major long-term target to be reached at international level to give credibility to the Paris Agreement targets. So this is only an instance, but it's real.
So her tears literally made history.
It's only a part of history of negotiations, I'd say.
Yeah. So, talking about personal levels and personal interactions at COP27, what do you do in your personal life that is environmentally sustainable, and would you would think you would say that are your efforts towards tackling climate change?
In this regard, I think the most relevant tool at the personal level is the carbon footprint, especially in developed countries when we have massive individual carbon footprints regarding our consumption patterns and also the production patterns of the goods we do consume. Mine is quite high only because of international missions I have that do force me to take the plane and to flight for personal issues, professional issues. But if I just take the flights out of my carbon footprint, I'm very close to having one line with the 1.5 degrees Paris targets because I'm flexitarian but enough to have a low footprint in that regard. I bike every day. I don't take any flight for personal reasons, so I'm close to it. It's very hard to be so, and the next steps for me are what we call deep ecology ones that I'm not sure I'm able this stage to be able to reach them. But of course, the flying issues is a real one for me. I bother my friends and families and relatives because of that. I just say that to them in the context of the French one, we should not be allowed to have convenience or recreative flights considering our carbon footprints at the moment. But this is still very popular. This is into our normal conception, of basing mode of uh, way of life, if I may say so. So it's even really difficult in our context, even with people that are connected with the issue, to persuade them that we had some levels, some levies at the personal level. And I should say that this might be one of the most efficient ones. We think about the international agreements, we think about national implementation of those, which is actually the most efficient way to have to deliver results regarding climate action. But in the developed countries context, the individual scale is the most relevant because we have means, we have tools, and we have possibilities. And I say that as a citizen, but also as a professional, but I do think that we have in our hands possibilities to, at our level, be close to the 1.5 trajectory. It's very difficult to maintain. That implies a lot of, little sacrifice, if I may say so, but little ones. So yeah, in my context, I would say that this is what I think I'm able to do at the moment.
That's amazing to hear because I was reading somewhere that after the Super Bowl performance or the opening ceremony, about 200 to 400 private jets flew off the nearest airport. So that's just like amazing to hear that that's what's happening in the US. And but I believe that Europe is a lot more conscious and puts in a lot way more effort than the US. Okay, so coming to on to the last question, what do you think is the one quality or skill that everybody should have in themselves, regardless of whatever the career is? What's one life skill that one should have?
Um, I'm, always or very frequently asked about the hope issue. Am I optimistic or pessimistic? I always answer this. This is not about pessimism or optimism. We're not like trying to guess. We're trying to act. And so, in this regard, the most efficient way to think about climate change issue and environmental ones as a whole is the hope. And a very ancient French politician that was called Léon Blum back in the 20th century mainly say that I do believe because I hope for it, and I hope because I believe. So this is also about personal beliefs, and even if we enter this era of consequences, we have means, and even if we go below or we even if we reach the 2.7 1.7, I'd say we'll still have room to prevent to reach the 1.8 degrees of global warming. So in every ton of carbon that is not emitted, we're making the world a better place. This is not my idea. This is the one of an American scientist, Michael Mann. But I do believe his sentence is the wisest in the developed countries context. Every ton of carbon that is not emitted makes the world better. I will finish with this quotation.
That's a very good saying and very interesting. Thank you so much, Mr. Jourdain, for taking out the time to do this. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'm sure all the listeners, along with me, have learned a lot today about, especially the negotiations, because that's something that I was very curious about, and seems very exciting. Especially because I've done Model United Nations, so I was very curious about how diplomats, especially French diplomats, work and how what their thinking is. Um, Thank you so much for your time, and
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very grateful and looking forward on this conversation.